Namaskar. We will be continuing with our discussion on the selling process. Today we begin with the fifth module, and this is the first lecture in the fifth module on our course on sales and distribution management. The topic here is something which we started in the previous lecture, which is the selling process, and in this particular lecture we shall be completing this particular topic. Now, in the previous lecture, we spoke about how salespersons follow a sequence of activities while they make a sale, and these different activities may be defined as the different phases which are generally followed by a salesperson. Of course, I did mention that whether a salesperson would actually follow the process or the different stages in entirety or in a particular order is something which cannot be generalized or which cannot be said for certainty, because based on the kind of product and service that a salesman sells, based on the kind of segment he caters to, based on the kind of the prospect he faces or experiences, based on the kind of selling situation he faces, he may not follow the sequential order, or he may go across the stages successfully, or he may get stuck in one of the stages and he has to go back, or it may so happen that after a particular stage the sales process gets totally terminated. So it's not very sure and for very certain that a salesperson would actually go through these different stages or through these different phases of the selling process. Nonetheless, the sales cycle starts with identification of a prospect or a potential customer and ends where he is converted into as a customer. So the cycle starts from the salesperson's end, where he actually identifies a prospect and then converts him into a customer. And as we discussed in the previous lecture, that in the case of industrial buying, the process is something which is very complex and the sales cycle is something which is very, very lengthy, because in case of industrial buying or in the case of B2B scenario, the purchase decision making unit, which is the buying center, comprises people from different departments, different divisions, different levels, and they have their different orientations or perspectives to making a choice between the vendors or between the products that are to be bought. And so this would often require the salesperson making multiple sales calls. Sometimes the salesperson may adopt a team selling approach, and so this would mean that he would have to meet different people in the buying center with a different sales team or a selling team, and may have to make multiple sales calls. Now, we stopped at different kinds of selling methods which a salesperson could choose from, and we also discussed the fab and the sell sequence. Now, if we go back, what we have done till now, we have talked about prospecting and qualifying, how leads are generated, and once the leads are generated, they are qualified as prospects. Because not all leads can be prospects. It is only those leads who have a need or a want and have sufficient purchasing power who actually qualify as a prospect. And then the salesperson moves to a pre-approach and a pre-call planning, where he obtains information about the prospect, his company, the kind of problems that they may be facing, and then he approaches where he meets the prospect for the first time, greets him, interacts with him, tries to build a rapport with him, goes in for a question and answer session so that he can actually emphasize upon the need, benefit, or the problems solution via the product or service that he has to offer. So in order to be able to emphasize that, he asks a series of questions so that he can have a product solution linkage, or he can have a need benefit linkage, and then he makes a presentation and gives a demonstration. So while he is making a presentation, he could actually adopt from several options. He could either have a canned approach, or he could go in for a formula approach, or he could go for a need satisfaction approach, or he could go for a team selling approach, which we discussed was something where he can go adopt the consultative selling or the problem selling style, and he can actually show how his product and its features, advantages and benefits can actually lead to a solution for a problem that the customer is facing. The difference between the need satisfaction and the consultative problem solving is that while both of them may emphasize upon the features, advantages and benefits, in the case of need satisfaction, it is not much of a team selling approach, but in the case of a consultative and problem solving approach, it is a team selling approach where cross functional team is used to identify or help identify a prospect's problem and provide a solution to the product which the salesperson has to offer. So, in the case of a need satisfaction, it is more unstructured, and dialogue and communication or or interaction occurs sequentially as and when questions are being asked and answers are being delivered. But in the case of a team selling approach, it is more of a cross functional team trying to help the prospect with a solution to a problem that that the client is or the prospect is facing. So, also we discussed that the features, advantages and benefits approach can be very successfully used as a sales sequence where he shows the features, explains the advantages and links them to the benefit and listens to the customer, lets the customer or the prospect talk. So, this is where we stopped, and now we will move further with the next stage, which is the overcoming of objections. Now, once the presentation is made, the next stage in the selling process is handling objections which have been posed by the prospect. Now, objections by a prospect must be handled very carefully. In fact, if objections are taken care of satisfactorily, the likelihood of a sales is always higher. The likelihood of a sales happening is much higher. Now, what are these objections? Now, very often the salesperson, when he makes a presentation or gives a demo, a lot of doubts or a lot of questions arise in the prospect's minds regarding the product or regarding the attributes of a product or the advantages that are being promised or offered, or with respect to the price, etc. So, there could be several of these doubts in the prospects' minds, which actually surface up in this stage where as sales objections. Now, a salesperson must not react to these queries or objections negatively, rather he must encourage them. He should neither react to them negatively nor he should react to them aggressively, and in fact he should try to address them as calmly and patiently as possible. Now, there can be two types of sales objections, or one are the psychological and the hidden, and the second is the logical and the real. Now, what are psychological or hidden objections? These relate to one's values, one's beliefs, the resistance to spend money, the resistance to buy expensive products, the resistance to buy or try out anything which is new. So, these are things which remain hidden and may not always be understood or made understood by the salesperson, as they are never made explicit by the prospect. They remain hidden. They remain hidden below the surface, and so the salesperson may not be always able to understand them, although it is very important that he also is able to gain an insight into such kind of psychological or hidden objections. The other kind of objections which a salesperson faces are more logical and real, which pertain to the product itself, the price of the product, the delivery terms, the delivery schedule, etc. So, with respect to the psychological or the hidden questions, these can objections, these should be dealt with by asking questions. And again we have takeaways from the spin which we discussed in the previous lecture. Logical or real objections, on the other hand, can also be dealt with by asking questions, or they can be dealt with by turning these objections into benefits. Like, for example, if the prospect questions as to why the salesperson does not offer a warranty or a guarantee of here the salesperson could also always say that, well, we do not offer it because you will not need it. We are so sure about our product being useful to you or being something of value to you that we know things will never go wrong, and so we do not feel the need that we should offer you a warranty because you will never have anything to complain about. So, this is another way where they could turn a point of objection into benefit. Another point of objection could be with respect to the price, where the prospect may say or question, it's more expensive, your competitor offers it at much lesser. So, you here again can turn this objection into a benefit by saying that, yes, but we also give you a long repayment period. The competitor gives you a repayment period of just 6 months, we give you a repayment period of 2 years or 3 years. So, in this way you could turn a point of objection into a benefit. Logical objections can also be dealt with by denying the objections in entirety, by saying that what is being understood is something which is not true, or what is being perceived by the prospect as an objection is something which is fictitious, it is not true at all. Salesperson may also resort to third party certifications via accreditations. They may also come down and provide reliefs in the form of discounts in case there is a problem with the product, or in case there is a problem with respect to the delivery schedule or something like that. In that case, if there are delays going to happen with respect to delivery, or if there is some problem with the product which is not so big but yet has been identified by the prospect before even the sale has been closed. In that case, or maybe the product has a attribute or a feature which relates to an outdated technology. In that case, to encourage the prospect towards closure of the sale, the salesperson could offer compensation by reducing the price, or by giving more discounts, or by relaxing terms of payment, etc. So, these are different ways in which the logical or the real objections as posed by the prospect can be handled. So, it is important that the salesperson does not react to queries and objections negatively, neither he should be aggressive. In fact, he must perceive them as signs of interest by the prospect, and the salesperson must strive to remove those objections by providing information that would help clear doubts and queries in the prospect's mind and make him more confident about the product, about the company, thereby moving to a stage of purchase. So, it is also important that to understand that salespersons will face objections all the time, and they may face these objections any time during a presentation, and the salesperson must learn to overcome these objections. He must be ready with answers to concerns that arise in the minds of the prospects. Now, some of these objections are standard ones, they can be anticipated because they are asked by several prospects who face similar situations. So, it is important that the salesperson handles them as and when they arise. Salesperson, and it will not be difficult, because these will be those objections which are standard ones, which the salesperson faces very frequently or experiences very frequently, because the objection relates to similar issues being faced by similar customers. So, the sales objection may relate here to the prospect seeking more information clearly, and it is important that the salesperson responds to the prospect's objection very carefully. In case where a salesperson is not able to handle the query or objection, he must ask for some time to get back. This would give the salesperson some time to collect more information and restructure his thoughts and future dialogue. Okay, now, so a little more on the strategies to deal with objections. One is asking questions to remove objections. So, again, takeaways from the spin, where in case you ask a prospect about a situation question, and then you move on through problem questions and implication questions. When you reach to the need payoff questions, you will the salesperson would be in a position to make the prospect realize that there are of course no objections at all, and the benefit that he would gain out of a purchase of a product or service offering is something which will help him meet a problem. So, an intelligent salesperson would ask questions to remove objections. For example, if a prospect has a question with respect to an increased price as compared to a competitor. So, if the prospect here asks the salesperson, well, what you offer to me is something which is more expensive than the one which is offered by the competitors, or we are buying this from a supplier A and or your competitor, that is the competitor, and his product or service is much cheaper than what you have to offer to us. So, this is a price objection, and this price objection could be dealt with by the salesperson very intelligently by asking a question. Well, sir, does he give you this technology, or do you think he is the right person to give you technology, or does he hold this third party certification? So, in these ways, or does he give you this feature? We do not think so. So, in this way, as you are asking the question to the prospect would realize that yes, there is no objection at all, because what he gets from the current vendor is something which may be an outdated technology, or may not be something which gives those kinds of features and advantages which this salesperson is offering. So, ultimately the prospect would realize that yes, I should not be objecting to this at all, because through this particular question which has been posed by the salesperson, the prospect would understand via his answer that yes, I do not think I am right to be actually objecting to the increased price. So, in this way the salesperson would be able to handle an objection. Another way is, as I said, if the salesperson is not well equipped to handle the query or the objection, he must postpone future dialogue and future interaction to a later date. Another tactic which you may use is a direct denial. No, I do not think you are right with this objection, or an indirect denial. He could also pass up and ignore the question at all. Now, in case of a buying center where there is where there are multiple decision makers, and if it is a team selling approach, so a particular salesperson who is unable to handle a query may pass it off to another, or completely ignore the question, that is, or the query or the objection. Another technique that may be used is dodge, where he neither denies nor ignores, and uses his body language to deal with such a kind of a objection or a situation. Now, there could be certain techniques to handle objections. Of course, the first is ask questions. Second, of course, we spoke about how you can turn points of objections into benefits. Now, cues here, or certain takeaways could be make comparisons with your competitor and convert the objection into a benefit, or stress upon exclusive features and differences again, and turn those objections into benefits. Or convert a prospect to a lower priced item. Now, here in this particular case, if price has been an objection, and it explicitly comes up to the surface that the prospect is not too keen to close the sale because of price issues, or because he feels that the product offering is something which is very expensive, which is out of budget. In that case, the salesperson could actually bring him down and offer to him a product which is lower priced, substitute. So, a lower price substitute by the same company, a lower priced variant by the same company is something which can be offered to such prospects for whom increased price is an objection. Also, another way by how you can turn points of objections into benefits is by breaking the price into different units and showing how the actual price is something which is equivalent to what competitors offer, because competitors do not break the price and the cost into separate figures, but here we are actually breaking the cost and the price into different figures. So it makes the price appear to be more logical or realistic, or something which is more acceptable to the prospect, rather than rather than looking it as a single digit high priced unit. Now, other techniques could be deny the objections either directly or indirectly, and quantify the differences, use third party certifications and accreditations, compensate to the customer by lowering down prices or by changing delivery terms, especially if you realize that yes, your product is something which is a little outdated with respect to technology which the competitor is offering, or the product lacks an feature or an attribute which leads to a desired advantage or a benefit, or you realize that the delivery schedules could not be will not be able to meet, you will not be able to meet the delivery schedules very aptly or accurately. In those cases, you can always compensate by lowering down the prices. So these are ways or techniques to handle the objections. The next stage which we have is the trial close and closing of the sale. Now, the trial close, this particular stage of the trial close occurs after the presentation has been made, objections have been dealt with, but the order has not been placed. So, the trial close aims at assessing the prospect's attitudes before closing the sale, and it seeks to it aims at seeking the prospect's opinion about closing of the sale. So, this particular stage of trial close gains an insight, helps gain an insight into what the prospect is thinking about, whether he would actually buy the product, or whether he would not buy the product, or he would postpone the purchase to a later date. The trial close stage is again something which is very crucial, because if the salesperson can deal with this stage carefully, he would be able to close the sale. So, the stage occurs after the presentation has been made, after the objections have been dealt with, but the order is yet to be placed, and it is aimed at assessing the prospect's attitude before closing the sale and seeking his opinions before a sale is finally closed. So, in this particular stage, the salesperson gets an idea as to whether the prospect is impressed with the fab or with the features, advantages and benefit approach. He is also able to assess whether the objections have been cleared or dealt with satisfactorily, and if any other objections remain which must be answered. And the salesperson is also able to judge if the prospect is ready to order. Now, if the prospect's response to the trial question is positive, it would mean that a sale will happen. On the other hand, if his response to trial close question is negative, it would mean that the salesperson must start all over again. He may have to make another demonstration, he may have to make another presentation, he may have to handle objections again so as to be able to move towards the trial close. Closing. Now, this is the stage when the salesperson asks the customer for an order. Now, the salesperson must help the prospect make a decision. Again, problem solution linkage or the need benefit linkage becomes very important, because during the last few minutes, or during this this stage, it may be important that the prospect may require a push from the end of the salesperson, and the salesperson may have to be extra persuasive at this particular stage so that the sale will happen. So, of course, the prospect may exhibit certain signs and signals that he is ready to make an order for the product. He may ask some questions, he may ask other people's opinions, he may examine the product more closely, look at the leaflet or the brochure or the pamphlet, and or the sample, and he may examine the inquiry examine the delivery terms or the price terms. Okay, so these will be signals which will be indicative of the fact that a sale may happen. Now, at this stage, as I said, the salesperson has to be a little more active, he has to be more persuasive, and he would have to adopt one or few of the techniques to close the sale. There could be different kinds of techniques which may be used to close the sale. There could be an alternative choice technique, minor points technique, assumptive technique, summary of benefits technique, special offer technique, probability technique, or the negotiation. So, let us go into each one of these now. Now, the alternative choice close technique is when the salesperson would pose a question to the prospect as to, sir, which of the three models do you prefer? So, the salesperson here asks the prospect for his choice. The question would be, which is the model you prefer, sir, A, B or C? Okay. So, the response from the prospect could be, I prefer A, or the prospect may pose some more questions which, if handled carefully, can lead to the sale. Okay. The salesperson here, that means, asks the prospect for a choice, and that is how he moves on. The second technique which may be used is the minor points choice close. Now, this again similar to the alternative choice close, where the salesperson asks the prospect a question. If you have decided to buy the product, which model would you prefer? How would you like to pay, sir? And when and where would you like it to be delivered? So, again it is something similar to the alternative choice close, but more in detail and depth, talking about how the payment will be made and whether the prospect would carry the product on his own or whether he would want it to be delivered. If he would want it to be delivered, when would he want it to be delivered? So, you are going a little more deeper into the tasks and activities associated with closing of the sale and delivery of the product. The third is the assumptive close technique. The assumptive close technique, as the term goes, is based on the salesperson's assumption that the sale will definitely take place. So, the salesperson feels that he has been able to win the trust and confidence of the prospect, and the prospect is now ready to make a purchase. So, there could be some verbal and non-verbal cues. The verbal cues, in terms of questions like, would you be paying via cash or a credit card? Would you carry it home or should you get it delivered? So, these are the kind of questions which the salesperson would ask when he is quite sure that the sale is about to happen, and so he asks very clear cut questions. On the other hand, there could also be non-verbal cues in terms of the prospect is there, and in his presence the salesperson begins packing the product or begins preparing the bills, or he begins setting up the POS machine or the point of sale payment machine. So, in this case what the salesperson is assuming is that the sale will definitely happen, and through a verbal question like how would you pay or how would you want it to get delivered, or through non-verbal cues like packing the product or arranging for billing, he is convinces or the pushes the prospect to close the sale. Another technique which is used is summary of benefits close, where the salesperson assesses the kind of benefits that would appeal to the prospect, and then he uses the FAB statements and the sell sequence. The FAB statements in terms of the features, advantages and benefits, and the sell sequence which is show the features, explain the advantages, link them to the benefits, and let the customer talk or listen to the customer. Then we have the T account close technique, where the salesperson makes a large T on the chart paper on a sheet of paper, where on the left side he places the assets or the pros of the purchase or the pros to act. On the other hand, on the right side he places the liabilities or the cons of the purchase, which is not to act, and accordingly he decides to see whether the prospect is more towards and inclined towards to act, or is inclined towards not to act, and accordingly he would take this forward. There is another technique which is used is the special offer close. This particular technique is adopted when the prospect resists closure despite best of efforts on the parts of the salesperson. So, in the ultimate, the salesperson asks the prospect, okay sir, if you buy this model today, there is a deal for it, which is a discount of 4%, but this offer is only valid for today. So, this is how he pushes the prospect to act now, or to enter into the transaction as soon as possible, so that the prospect is made to feel that there is a special offer for him, and he should not let go the opportunity. Then we have the probability close technique. Now, this particular technique is used in cases where the prospect is not too sure about making the purchase, and here the salesperson he tells the salesperson that yes, I'll come back, let me think over it and I'll come back again, or maybe give me a few hours or a few days and I'll get back. So, in this kind of a situation, the prospect is not too sure about making a purchase, and he tells the salesperson that he has to think a little more and he would get back soon. So, the salesperson here must actually use this the probability close technique by encouraging objections from the prospect, whether they are hidden or whether they are real, and he must encourage objections by asking questions from the prospect, and he must attempt at overcoming these objections so that he can move towards closure. There is another method which may be used, which is called the negotiation close technique, which is a very popularly used technique. It's a very popular method, and the closure technique involves bargaining between the salesperson and the prospect. It involves negotiation between them, who agree on mutually satisfying arrangements with respect to the price or the delivery terms or the warranties, guarantees, etc. So, the negotiation style that must be adopted by the prospect and the salesperson is something which should be integrative. Both the parties should feel a win-win situation, they must experience a win-win situation, and so the negotiating style must be something which is a win-win style, which would lead to both the parties feeling that they have gained out of the transaction. It has been mutually beneficial, mutually satisfying, and this would lead to long-term relationship between the two parties. The final stage in the selling process is the follow up and the service. Now, this is a very, very essential stage to ensure customer satisfaction, and it aims at serving customers after a sale has been done. Now, it's very important that salespersons understand that while a sale has happened today, it should happen again, and if it has to happen again, the customer must be satisfied, so that there is loyalty and long-term relationships can be built. So, the salesperson must also understand that customer satisfaction leads to customer retention. So, follow-up and service would involve keeping a check on order processing, delivery schedules, that is the product has been delivered on time, payments have been received, and any kind of deals and discounts which were promised have been actually delivered to the prospect. The products has been installed when demonstrations have been provided, and so it would also mean keeping a check on installations, keeping a check on demonstrations, keeping a check on building long-term relationships and customer relationship management. It would also mean keeping a check on after sales and warranties. So, follow-up and service would involve order processing, delivery schedules, payments, installations, demonstrations, after sales and warranties, so that long-term relationships can be built. Follow-up can also lead to more sales. The same customer would feel happier ordering products which are which are variants of the existing, or are similar product lines, and so in this way the company could gain more business from already existing customers. So, follow-up can also lead to more sales. Mutually agreed upon conditions of sale and delivery must be adhered to for building trust and loyalty of the customers, and for building long-term relationships. So, with this we come to an end of this lecture. The references are still Kandiv, Govani, Puri, Sales and Distribution Management, Pearson, Havaldar and Kavale, 2007, 8 and 17, McGraw-Hill. Panda and Sahdev, Sales and Distribution Management, Oxford University Press, and Futrell, Fundamentals of Selling, McGraw-Hill, 13th edition. So, this brings us to an end of the first lecture on the 5th module of the course. With this, we also conclude our discussion on the selling process. I hope you found this to be fruitful and enjoyable. Thank you.